with your host, Mr. Uhel Barrickman.
Welcome to another Glasgow Wants to Know. We're fortunate tonight in that we have a native son for our program. In addition to being a native son, he is the auditor for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. He's had considerable experience in various things before he became the state auditor. So we'll start with a little bit about your background. There's a lot of people who've moved into Glasgow since you left. And where did you go to school? What's your education?
Well, I graduated from Heistville High School in 1969 and then from Center College in Danville in 1973. I went on to the University of Louisville and got a law degree from there in 1976, and thereafter came back home to Barron County and was affiliated with the New Farmers National Bank for 10 years.
As trust officer?
Trust officer, investments manager, and secretary to the board.
And then from there you went to Frankfurt, and I believe as the banking commissioner.
In 1988, Governor Wallace Wilkinson called and asked if I would be willing to serve as his commissioner of financial institutions, popularly known as banking commissioner. I agreed to that and served during his tenure, and then Governor Brereton Jones asked me if I would continue. And I was willing to do that as well, so I served 2 terms. I was the first banking commissioner in over 30 years to serve 2 different governors in that role. And then as I got toward the end of that second term, I was trying to decide what I would do after that was over, and I got the idea that there were some parallels between the job of Commissioner of Banking and the job of Auditor of Public Accounts. And so I decided to run for Auditor of Public Accounts in 1995 and was elected.
Now, let's talk a little bit about the duties, responsibilities of the banking commissioner. It is an interesting subject here since we've got 5 banks and another group has applied for a charter. So tell us a little bit about the banking commissioner, responsibilities and duties.
Well, the role of banking commissioner is a public protection role in which you manage and recruit and motivate teams of examiners who go into the banks and the credit unions and the savings and loan associations and the savings banks and the consumer finance companies and the industrial loan companies in Kentucky, and who police the securities industry. And the role of the banking commissioner is to protect the public interest in having sound financial institutions at work in our Commonwealth. I'm proud to say that I had a bit to do with changing the competitive environment for banking in Kentucky. When I was banking commissioner, the federally chartered banks in our nation were authorized at that time to move their main offices, in some cases even across county lines. And so I issued what was known then as a parity ruling for state chartered banks so that they could achieve the same competitive objective as a national bank and move their main offices across a county line if they met certain tests for soundness and competitiveness in public service. And so that's one of the reasons that Glasgow and a number of other communities around Kentucky have a larger number of competing financial institutions these days.
Now, what does the banking commissioner have to do with chartering a new bank?
Well, the Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions is the primary chartering agency for state chartered banks. It shares the responsibility for issuing such a charter with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, a federal agency. In the instance of Kentucky's banking code, if the FDIC issues a certificate of insurance to a group of incorporators, and they have produced information to the Banking Commission that they have obtained adequate capital, then the Banking Commissioner will issue a charter for them to be able to operate.
How is the sufficiency of capital determined?
The sufficiency of capital is determined on the basis of what's called a pro forma, that is, in essence, a prediction of what the competitive environment is going to be during the next 5 years for that new bank. How much in deposits is that bank likely to attract? How much are those deposits going to cost that bank? What sort of loan products will that institution be offering to the public in that market area? Is there a perceived need in the community for that kind of financial product and service to be offered? How much need will there be to increase the amount of capital that this new and growing financial institution will have to have within a 5 to 10 year period? And that's the basis on which both the FDIC and the Kentucky Department of Financial Institutions determines how much bank capital there ought to be.
Now, are there any means provided for competing banks or established banks to object and have a hearing?
Yes. There is an opportunity for any of the competitors to contact the Department of Financial Institutions and to lodge with the department their support or objections to a charter application. It is the custom of the Department of Financial Institutions examiners to come into the community where an application for a new bank charter is being sought and to interview the competing financial institutions, ask them how they feel about it, to do some research out in the community to see what kind of financial products and services are being offered, what the competitive environment looks like. The department also consults with the controller of the currency, the administrator of national banks, to talk about the position within that competitive environment that the national banks occupy. And so in that way, the Department of Financial Institutions tries to get a general overall picture about the environment in which the applicants seek to begin operation.
Usually, how long does it take to get a charter?
That does vary rather considerably. During my time as Commissioner of Financial Institutions, it would take the better part of a year to receive final approval for a charter. It's not certain in my mind whether that has been telescoped any in either direction in the last 4.5 years that I've been out of that job.
Well, one of the reasons, of course, I'm asking these questions is the fact that there is a group that's seeking a charter, and there are questions in the public about it, and I knew you'd know the answer to many of the questions based on your past experience.
Well, the big debate that always went on among banking regulators, and I presume it goes on today, is whether the regulator should concern itself primarily with providing opportunities for competition for consumers of financial goods and services, or whether it should be more concerned with the issue of an area being overbanked. If an area is overbanked and that creates an impediment to the success of any one of the institutions that may exist in the market, then that becomes a concern for the regulator.
Now let's talk about the Office of Auditor. What's the function of the office?
Well, the Auditor of Public Accounts is one of 7 statewide constitutional officers set out in the Kentucky Constitution. And it is the expectation of those who framed our successive Kentucky constitutions that the Auditor of Public Accounts would be the taxpayer protector of the state office holders. That is to say, our office has the authority to audit state and local government agencies for the purpose of determining whether the tax dollars that Kentuckians are investing in state and local agencies are being preserved and invested wisely and used to fund programs that serve the public interest.
How many employees?
We have 155 employees in our office and an annual budget of almost $10 million.
Has that grown any since you were there?
We've increased the number of employees by 5 in the 4 years and now 6 months or so that I have been in the office. And the growth in the number of employees of 5 is attributable mostly to my establishment of the Division of Performance Audit in our office. I introduced performance audits into the office when I came there on January the 1st of 1996.
So you audit your own office?
We are part of a, well, there are 2 ways in which we are subjected to scrutiny. First of all, we are part of the National State Auditors Association peer review, which does a periodic review of the performance standards that apply to those who are certified public accountants and who are part of the accounting profession. The other thing that we've accomplished is to create a division within our office whose job is to do quality assurance of the audit work that we're conducting in state and local agencies.
Now, of the employees, how many of them are accountants, and do they have to be CPAs?
Roughly 70% of the employees of our office have accounting backgrounds. The statutes require that that percentage of our staff have at least 20 semester hours of accounting in their undergraduate careers, or 30 quarter hours. And the rest of our employees are administrative in nature, and some of them have backgrounds in a variety of academic disciplines, and they bring those complementary experiences to bear on the performance auditing that we do, a kind of a non-accounting type audit that we conduct.
Now, those that go out in the state to conduct an audit of state institutions, are they usually CPAs or just the background accountants that have had the required number of hours?
All of our audits are performed either by certified public accountants or by accounting professionals who are supervised by certified public accountants.
How many CPAs do you have in your office?
We have about 40 CPAs at this moment.
How do you determine, and I know that every year you all do audits of various governmental agencies, as you have indicated. First of all, how do you determine how many you're going to do within a year?
Well, the numbers stay roughly within the area of 500 to 600 audits a year produced by my office. And among that number of audits, we have in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 state program audits that we are conducting. And the balance of the audits that we do are in local governments across Kentucky. We are mandated by statute to audit every fiscal court and every county sheriff and every county clerk on an annual basis, except in those cases where, because we don't have enough staff, we can grant to the local official or the local fiscal court the authority to hire their own private CPA to conduct the audit. We have an internal office policy that at least once every 4 years, every local official in Kentucky will see an auditor from our office.
How about school districts?
Our office's connection with elementary and secondary education in Kentucky is one that I have revitalized in my 4 years as Auditor of Public Accounts. Before I got there, for almost 10 years, we did not conduct any audits in school districts in Kentucky. And the reason for that was that the work was handled by private CPA firms whose contracts were initialed by the local boards of education and were scrutinized by the State Committee for School District Audits. Now, the Auditor of Public Accounts is chairman of the State Committee for School District Audits. And as chair of that committee, it is our responsibility to make sure that the model contracts that every school district in Kentucky grants to a private CPA firm every year to conduct their annual financial statement audit has in it the proper procedures and meets all of the accounting standards that are required of us both by the accounting profession itself and by government auditors.
Well, does your office have to give the school boards permission? As you indicated, some of the state officials, such as county clerks and so forth, does your office have to give the school districts permission to have their own auditors, or is that a part of the law concerning school districts?
We do not have to give school districts permission to hire a private CPA to conduct their annual audit, except in the sense that the chair of the State Committee for School District Audits approves the model contract that has been executed by the school district and the private CPA firm.
Now, when they do a private audit, is that funneled to your office for your office's examination?
Those audits are warehoused in the Department of Education, and it is traditionally the Department of Education that has reviewed the audits that are submitted by the local school districts. The Auditor of Public Accounts has the authority to review all of those audits, but because of lack of resources, we've not been able to review them all historically. We've begun to pay quite a bit more attention to them during my tenure, simply because of our concerns about the need to try to improve the business practices that have been employed in public school districts.
Now, what about the audits that are done in state agencies by locally or state employed auditors with your permission? Do you have to review them?
Yes. First of all, we have the authority to review all audits, whether they are state or local in nature.
Including school districts?
In school districts, right.
Okay.
However, with regard to state agency audits, we are required, again, by Kentucky law to audit every state agency every year, except that the caveat is provided that if we do not have adequate auditors to send into all the state agencies, then we may give those agencies the authority to employ their own private CPA. But it is our custom to review the audits that come into us from all those state agencies.
Do you have any authority, once a school board or a local agency or any other state agency which have been given permission to do their own auditing, do you, once they employ a private auditor, do you review their qualifications before they can do the audit?
Yes. Our approval of their request to employ a CPA, a private CPA, to conduct the audit is conditioned upon our agreement that that particular CPA or CPA firm meets all the professional standards in Kentucky and also has a track record of producing audits that are in keeping with the standards that we've produced.
Now, you said a moment ago that you all did X amount of audits is in the hundreds every state. I mean, every year. You mean your personnel from Frankfurt goes out and does that many audits?
Yes, sir. Between 500 and 600 audits every year. And of course, if you consider that we have 120 counties, that means 120 fiscal courts and 120 sheriffs and 120 county clerks. And obviously just that many audits would amount to a considerable number. Now, we don't do all of them every year. Again, it is our practice to audit everyone at least once every 4 years.
How about state audits? By that I'm talking about state institutions, not local.
Yes, again, it is our office policy to try to audit each of them at least once every 4 years. Most of the work that we do in state government in Kentucky is within the context of something called the Federal Single Audit Act, which was enacted in 1982. And that federal law mandates that a particular kind of audit be conducted of state-level government agencies that receive federal funds. And so every year we conduct something that's known as the Statewide Single Audit Act audit for Kentucky. And in that audit, we audit all of the major programs of state government and a sampling of the minor programs of state government. And then we certify to the federal government that the findings that we have generated from our audit are such that we are capable of issuing a clean or, if we are required to do so, a qualified opinion of the state's general purpose financial statements.
Are you authorized and do you audit budgets for certain state agencies?
We occasionally offer that kind of service if the General Assembly asks it of us, but our audit of state-level government agencies, generally speaking, is confined to an audit of the financial statement and the extent to which that agency's financial statement feeds into the overall general purpose financial statements of the Commonwealth as a whole.
So if I understand you, as an example, the Legislative Research Commission, you would not audit the funds that are legislated for that.
Well, that's true, but the reason for that is that our authority does not extend outside the executive branch of state government. And LRC is a creature of the legislative branch, and so they are outside our jurisdiction, as is the judiciary.
I thought that the Constitution set up the requirements for a state auditor.
It does.
Well, where did the differentiation come in then, and how?
The
They are
differentiation.
branches of the government under the Constitution, same as, and by they I'm talking about the judicial branch, and the legislative branch the same as the executive branch.
The explanation is that even though the position of Auditor of Public Accounts is a constitutionally mandated position, the authority for that office is left to the General Assembly to decide by virtue of the laws that it passes from time to time. Strictly legislative authority. And so over the years, the General Assemblies of Kentucky have carved out the responsibilities of the state auditor to apply specifically to the executive branch. And we also have some court cases that have held that we don't have the authority to audit the judicial branch of government, for example.
Well, if you take it to extremes, in essence, if I understand you, the legislature could deprive you and your office of its powers to do audit and leave you like the Railroad Commission is in Kentucky now. Is that correct?
That is correct. Fortunately, over time, the legislature has perceived the value of the taxpayer protection role that we can provide, and in fact continues to fund us at levels that are adequate for us to do the job that we do. But it's, I guess that's the check and balance over the Auditor of Public Accounts. I frequently am asked the question, you audit everyone else, who audits you? Well, I guess the response to that is the General Assembly keeps in, at least in its field of vision, the way in which we do our job. And if it perceives value in what we do in our taxpayer protection work, then it continues to fund us. And if it doesn't, in theory, it might shut us down.
Now, how many executive agencies do you audit?
Well, we audit in the neighborhood of probably 150 state executive agencies. And we, through the offices of the Federal Single Audit Act, we do all of the major cabinets and their programs.
Because of federal money involved.
Exactly. And then we sample through the smaller agencies. There are a number of smaller agencies that, because of the federal law that says that nothing under $300,000 is material, some small state agencies are not part of that sample.
That's odd in a way.
Well, it's a gap. It is a gap in taxpayer protection, and we try our best to sample through as many as we can, even though the federal law doesn't demand it of us. But of course, when you've got 155 people and you've got almost 3,000 state and local government programs in your universe that represent probably in the neighborhood of 14 billion taxpayer dollars every year, it's very difficult to cover that entire universe in a way that's effective. And what we try to do is to penetrate that universe as thoroughly as we can. We don't have to audit every single one of those 3,000 agencies, but we have to make every one of them think they're next.
Now, let's talk about universities. Of course, we've got several in this state now. How often do you audit them?
Well, every public university in Kentucky is required to have an audit every year, but our office does not conduct them. They are conducted by private CPA firms under contract with the public university.
Well, do you have any supervision over whom they employ like you do for local governmental agencies?
No, we do not. In the late 70s, one of my predecessors decided that he was going to make a push to audit all of Kentucky's public universities. And at that time, the statutes not only gave the state auditor the authority to audit all the public universities, but it also required those public universities to pay the costs of the audit to the auditor if he chose to exercise his auditing responsibilities. When he made the push to audit all of them, that angered the public universities in Kentucky, and they had an amendment inserted into the audit chapter, KRS Chapter 43, that took out any reference to the requirement that the public universities had to pay for the cost of the audit. They didn't take away the state auditor's authority to audit, but they inserted what amounts to a financial disincentive for the state auditor to actually audit the public universities. And so that caused the Auditor of Public Accounts to step away from public higher education. And until I arrived there, we had not done any work to speak of in public universities in well over 10 years. I've begun to spend more time in Kentucky's public universities, to commit more of my the resources of my office to Kentucky's public universities. But we're still not in a position to actually conduct full-scope financial audits of every public university in Kentucky. We've just now agreed to go under contract with Kentucky State University to conduct a full-scope financial audit there.
But where they employ their own private auditors, and by they I'm talking about the universities, where they employ their own private auditors, they don't have to submit their audits to you for review like state agencies.
That's right. Our office has the authority to look at them, to receive them and take a look at them, but as to any requirement that we approve their choice of auditor or that they be beholden to our office in some way, that does not exist.
But as far as your state agencies are concerned, if I understand you, they are required to submit their audit to you each year.
That's correct.
But the universities are not.
That's correct. And the only way that my office can have an actual presence in full-scope financial audits in a public university in Kentucky is if that public university contracts with the office to do the audit. In other words, we would be competing with the private CPA firm to receive the contract to conduct that audit.
Now, if I understand you, you have recently entered into a contract with Kentucky State University to audit it.
That's correct.
Is that the first time there's been a contract with the state auditor to audit that university?
Yes, and in fact, it will be the first time that the state auditor's office has had a contract to do a full-scope financial audit for any Kentucky public university in many, many years.
In your judgment, did that have anything to do with the recent embezzlement and disappearance of money there?
Yes, it did. Kentucky State University hired the accounting firm of excuse me, PricewaterhouseCoopers to conduct their financial audit for the fiscal year ending June 30, 1999. Because of the embezzlement of almost $800,000, or actually more than $800,000, that our work has uncovered at Kentucky State University. And because of the weak controls that are in effect in that university's business office and the way it conducts its business affairs, PricewaterhouseCoopers has withdrawn from that engagement because they believe that there is too much legal liability associated with any attempt on their part to issue an opinion. And so my office has stepped in an effort to try to preserve the work product that PricewaterhouseCoopers was generating in the course of their audit work, to try to get to the truth about the financial audit of KSU for FYE June 30, 99.
But during the period and during the certainly let me back up a minute. As I understand from reading the paper, the lady that did most of the embezzling there had been doing it over a period of years.
That's correct.
Now, during that period, did they have the same outside auditors?
Yes, they did.
How did they miss that? I can't understand that, and I don't think the public understands that.
It's very frustrating to think that a full-scope financial audit can miss a fraud of that magnitude. But here's how it happens. Auditors are sampling the financial transactions that are flowing through the university's business office when they are doing an audit of the university's financial statement, to get to, in other words, to get to an opinion on its financial statement. They are not required to study every financial transaction that flows through that university. They are only required to sample enough of the transactions to satisfy themselves that the financial statement of the university does not contain material misstatements. The short answer to you is that there is a difference between a fraud detection audit and a financial statement audit. And it all has to do with the fact that the CPA firm or the auditor is sampling rather than searching for the minute transactions that may have contributed to a fraud.
Well, I would assume that the private auditors employed by the university would have the authority under the law to conduct a fraud audit.
Absolutely. In fact, accounting standards require any auditor who becomes aware of extremely weak financial controls or an actual instance of fraud to expand the testing, expand the sample of financial transactions that they are studying.
Any evidence that any fraud audits had been done at Kentucky State University within the last 5 years?
No, sir.
Last 10 years?
No, sir.
Now, you're talking about the sampling where they're not doing a fraud audit. I would assume that this is probably correct, but you would know more than I, but I would assume that they do about the same sampling every year. I mean, the same area.
Well, that does tend to happen, although that is something that makes those of us in auditing very uncomfortable. My office is very uncomfortable when we find that to be the case.
And you don't know whether that had been the case at State University, Kentucky State University, or not?
Well, yes, I think the answer to that is yes. Generally speaking, the same kind of cross-section of transactions was being studied year after year after year.
That's what I was afraid of. And it also seems to me that the CPA firm that was doing the audit, or not the CPA, the auditing firm that was doing it, should be concerned about litigation regardless of whether they made a final opinion. But that's out of your jurisdiction, I guess. I don't know.
It is.
I would assume that was in the jurisdiction. Well, let's back up a minute. I'm sure that it had some federal funds.
Absolutely.
So I would assume that is under the jurisdiction of Kentucky's General's office, as well as the federal courts, the district courts.
It would be, as well as
Attorney General's office.
As well as the Office of Inspector General of the United States Department of Education. And our office has been in contact with the OIG in Atlanta for the Federal Department of Education to talk about a joint effort that we might conduct with them to try to detect other instances of potential fraud that might exist.
Now, I guess that's enough to talk about that one. Let's talk about a lesser one that occurred in the school district, the Jefferson School District. Has your office had anything to do with checking on that since it occurred?
At this juncture, the internal auditors for the Jefferson County School District are responsible for having conducted the audit that discovered the fraud on the part of Jim and Patty Hearn, and they have also reinstituted their audit procedures to try to make sure that there is no repetition of that fraud.
How could that have gone on without somebody, not necessarily an auditor, detecting it? There again, the public doesn't understand that.
Well, I attribute a lot of the weakness that is associated with accountability in education to the fact that so many of the professionals who are associated with the educational apparatus are trained to be focused on classroom reform and the sort of accountability that comes from test scores and the sort of work that's being done within the classrooms themselves. And there is not a lot of attention that has been paid to accountability and to business practices. We did work in elementary and secondary school districts in 1996 and 1997 that revealed that elementary and secondary school districts in Kentucky were woefully inadequate in the way in which they handled money. They failed to put their money on interest in a timely fashion. They failed to get their federal reimbursements.
I see where you just won a lawsuit about the interest on now accounts.
Yes.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. I am very pleased at that outcome because we had, in that instance, a local official, in that case a sheriff, who argued that he was under no duty to pay over to the local school district the interest that the tax collections that he had been responsible for earned when they were placed in a now account.
I would assume, though, or I think he deserves a lot of credit because I suspect there are sheriffs out there that did what he was doing and didn't ask anybody about it.
Oh, there is definitely that fact.
So
But,
I think he deserves to be commended.
well, there are a whole host of practices that don't really qualify as good business practices that have been employed out there in elementary and secondary education and in some cases in higher education. And we're trying to call the attention of the public and of educators to these less than good business practices.
Let's get back to the Jefferson County situation for a few more questions. Again, it was the auditor's responsibility to find out what was going on, but it seems to me that the librarians certainly had some knowledge that there was money being appropriated and had been appropriated for encyclopedias, which they didn't have, and they weren't getting them. I don't understand why somebody didn't pick up on something there.
That is puzzling, and I really can't answer your question. Commonwealth's Attorney Dave Stingle is in charge of that prosecution and that case, and I presume that he has looked at the culpability of all of the parties that were involved in that situation.
I would also assume that there was some federal money involved as far as purchasing these encyclopedias are concerned.
I think that's right. I think there was.
And then that raises the question in my mind and has, why did the state rather than the federal government prosecute that case?
Well, I wouldn't presume to speak for the United States attorneys, but I have had a great deal of interaction with them and their staffs during the last 4.5 years. And I do know that they take a strong interest in certain kinds of cases and a not so strong interest in others. But if they think that the state prosecutor and the state audit apparatus is protecting the taxpayers adequately, then they will take their resources somewhere else and look at another issue.
Well, apparently the state prosecutors have done a good job as far as prosecuting the recipients of the embezzlement, husband and wife. just as an aside, that really has nothing to do, but it seems as though the women are having more influence on their husbands than they used to have when it comes to money. Now let's talk about the state education, Department of the State Education, and the embezzlement there. As I read the paper and understand it, there was actually an appendage of both the state, they were an appendage to the State Department of Education, and then an area of local educational departments without any supervision from anybody. Am I correct?
That's generally the case. We're talking about educational cooperatives. Educational cooperatives are organizations, consortia, or corporations that are created by virtue or under the auspices of the Kentucky Interlocal Cooperation Act, where local school districts band together and create a charitable nonprofit corporation, in most cases, for the purpose of helping carry out certain educational policies and programs. For example, one educational cooperative has grown up in Kentucky for the primary purpose of buying school buses at discounted prices and making those school buses available more cheaply to local school districts. Another educational co-op in Kentucky has grown up almost exclusively for the purpose of subsidizing the salaries of the highest echelon of administrators in the Kentucky Department of Education. And there are other purposes for which these consortia and educational co-ops have grown up.
But they're being funded by both state and federal funds, is that correct?
That is correct.
Any local funds involved?
Oh, yes.
The school districts?
The local school districts pay fees to these cooperatives for services rendered to them by the cooperatives. And so some of the cooperatives have as their primary duty providing continuing education.
But the local districts do not contribute to the capital. That comes from the state. In other words, they pay for the services that they receive. Is that correct?
That is, I think, generally correct. There are 9 cooperatives operating in Kentucky. And there are other lesser consortia, little groups that have sprung up. But basically, we're talking about a limited universe of about 9 cooperatives.
Now, insofar as the state education department was concerned, was there a specific budget item in there for those cooperatives?
The State Department of Education was in the habit, has been in the habit, of asking various cooperatives to conduct certain programs for them, and then the State Department of Education would issue a payment in some form to that cooperative. And in the case of most recent note, where former Deputy Commissioner Randy Kimbrough sent money to a co-op in eastern Kentucky on more than one occasion, so that that money would be taken out of the Department of Education's balance sheet just at the time, so that the General Assembly would not take into account that money when it was determining how many dollars the Department of Education had at its disposal. We call that parking. They were parking funds in a local cooperative so that it would take it off the State Department's balance sheet. When the budgeteers in the legislature came around to look at the State Department of Education's budget, they would see that that money didn't exist there, and in theory would fund it to a higher degree than they would if that money had not been parked.
Well, since the legislature authorized these cooperatives, it would seem that there would be an item in the State Department that it was budgeted for that purpose. But I take it that from what you tell me that that's not true.
Well, it isn't a line item. In other words, the funds came from a whole series of different places within the department's budget. And the problem we ran into was that in this particular instance, the department had given too much individual control to one employee to insist that checks be cut and sent to a cooperative, and the cooperative then was told to issue checks to different people or groups that were providing service to the co-op, and those checks were then sent to that employee. So there was far too much power and authority being invested in one person, and that's how the fraud was perpetrated.
That wasn't the only place where she had too much control, but that's another item. Did somebody tip somebody about that situation, or how was it discovered?
It was discovered by an auditor, an auditor commissioned by the Department of Education to audit the Eastern Kentucky Cooperative because of the need for a federal single audit of that cooperative. That cooperative was receiving federal funds, and that mandated a federal single audit be conducted. This particular auditor saw a transaction that she felt looked fishy, and she called our office, and we sent auditors to assist in that investigation and then uncovered the whole scheme.
Again, I know the State Department employs their own auditors for a yearly audit. It's still hard for me to conceive why during some years some auditor hadn't picked that up. That had been going on for 2 or 3 years also. How do you explain that?
As best we can determine, the reason it went undetected was because those of us who audit state-level agencies were looking at one side of that financial transaction, the side that originated in the Department of Education. Private CPAs were looking at that side of the transaction that originated at the school co-op. And because neither of us saw both sides of those transactions, it was not possible to detect that there was money flowing back and forth in a way that made the fraud possible. In other words, the character of the money changed from the time it was a check issued by the Department of Education to the cooperative to the time it was transformed into a check in payment for services by the cooperative back to others that were providing the service.
It seems that there should have been some check on that with the cooperatives out there.
Well,
I'm not saying that your office missed the boat, but it seemed to me that the auditors in the State Department should have determined what was going on and detected the fraud before it was actually done. And if I understand you, it wasn't the state that did it anyhow, it was the federal boys.
Well,
I mean, it came as a result of a requirement of the federal government.
It came as a result of a federal audit requirement, but it, of course, was an audit that was commissioned by the local cooperative and paid for by the local cooperative, and it was a private CPA who was actually doing that work.
Well, I understand that, but it was still a federal law rather than a state law that brought it out. How now let's go back to Kentucky State a minute. We're going to be running out of time here pretty soon. There are a few other things I want to ask you about. But let's go back to Kentucky State. Who found that and why and how?
The vice president for finance at Kentucky State got a telephone call from a food service vendor for the university. And the food service vendor said, "You owe us $196,000, and we haven't been paid, and it's an overdue bill. So I'm calling you to ask you to issue us a check." So the vice president had his staff investigate, and his staff reported to him that the bill had indeed been paid. And there was a check in the records, in the checking account records, that was payable to Sodexo Marriott Corporation for food service for $196,000. But when the vice president for finance examined the check more closely, it appeared that it had been altered. That is to say, the payee on the check had been altered. And so they called my office, the president of the university, called the Auditor of Public Accounts office and the Kentucky State Police and said, "I have a check here that I think looks peculiar." So I immediately sent our auditors in to the university, and we began our investigation. And what we found was that this check had been made payable to someone else. It had been cashed by someone else. And then the check, after it had cleared KSU's bank, had been altered as to its payee and was put back in the university's checking account records. And we discovered a series of checks that were handled in that fashion, that had been cashed by the bank and made payable to private individuals and some companies, some sham companies that these private individuals had put together.
Now there's public speculation that you're going to run for Attorney General in the next general election. You want to comment on that speculation one way or the other?
Well, I am flattered by any speculation about my political future. I will tell you that I hope that I can have some kind of a progressively more responsible role in government in the 2003 election. I'm not certain that the Attorney General's position is the one right now. I just haven't made a decision about that. I'll be quite honest with you. There are some folks who've been talking with me fairly seriously about the idea of actually considering a higher position.
By that, do you mean the governor's office?
I do. And it's just awfully early to speculate about that. I'm again flattered that anybody thinks about those things, but I just haven't made a decision. I just hope I'll have an opportunity to continue my service.
Well, good luck.
Thank you.
There's also, and I don't know whether you've heard this or know anything about it, but I'm hearing some speculation now that the Chief Justice is wanting the Republican nomination for governor. Have you heard that?
I've heard that same speculation. And I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, time's up. As I told you, we wouldn't have any trouble doing an hour. You've given the public, I think, some useful information and have explained things that at least people around here have been wondering about. I thank you, Ed, for coming, and as I say, good luck in the future.
Uhel, thank you for having me on your program. I'm very honored to be here.
Thank you.